Marcus Thompson had always been different from the other boys in his neighborhood. While they spent their afternoons playing video games or hanging out at the mall, he could be found in his backyard, practicing with his old compound bow that his grandfather had given him before passing away. The bow was nothing fancy, its paint chipped and strings frayed, but it was Marcus's most treasured possession. At 17, Marcus was tall and lanky, with unruly brown hair that never seemed to stay in place and thick-rimmed glasses that made his green eyes appear larger than they were. His clothes were often hand-me-downs from older cousins, and his sneakers had seen better days. In a school where brand names and the latest fashions mattered more than character, Marcus stood out for all the wrong reasons. The Thompson family lived in a modest two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. Marcus's mother, Sarah, worked double shifts at the local diner to make ends meet after his father had left when Marcus was 12. Money was always tight, and luxuries were few and far between. But Sarah had instilled in her son the values of hard work, determination, and never giving up on his dreams, no matter how impossible they might seem. Marcus's passion for archery had started when he was 8 years old during a summer visit to his grandfather's farm. The old man had been a veteran who served in the military and later became a local hunting guide. He had shown Marcus the fundamentals of archery, teaching him about stance, breathing, and the mental discipline required to hit a target consistently. Those few weeks each summer had been the highlight of Marcus's childhood, and after his grandfather's death, the bow became his connection to those precious memories. Every day after school, Marcus would set up targets in the small patch of grass behind their apartment building. He had fashioned his own targets from cardboard and hay, marking them with hand-drawn circles and numbers. The other kids in the building thought he was weird, spending hours alone shooting arrows at pieces of cardboard. Some of the older teenagers would occasionally stop by to mock him, calling him names and questioning why he wasn't playing normal sports like basketball or football. At school, things weren't much better for Marcus. Jefferson High was dominated by three main social groups: the athletes who ruled the hallways with their Letterman jackets and confident swagger, the popular kids who seemed to have unlimited money for the latest trends, and the academic elite who looked down on anyone who wasn't planning to attend an Ivy League university. Marcus fit into none of these categories, making him an easy target for ridicule. The worst of his tormentors was Brad Mitchell, the star quarterback of the football team. Brad came from one of the wealthiest families in town, lived in a mansion on the hill, and drove a brand-new sports car that cost more than Marcus's mother made in 2 years. Brad was everything that Marcus wasn't: popular, confident, and seemingly blessed with natural talent in everything he tried. More importantly, Brad seemed to take personal pleasure in making Marcus's life miserable. "Look, it's Robin Hood," Brad would sneer whenever he saw Marcus in the hallways, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Found any sheriffs to fight lately, loser?" His friends would laugh on cue, and Marcus would feel his face burn with embarrassment as he hurried to his next class, clutching his worn backpack tighter. The harassment wasn't limited to verbal taunts. Brad and his crew would sometimes accidentally bump into Marcus, sending his books flying across the hallway. They would make shooting motions with their hands whenever they saw him, making exaggerated archer poses while their friends erupted in laughter. Once, they had even gone so far as to leave fake arrows made from pencils and paper in his locker with notes calling him a medieval freak. Despite the constant bullying, Marcus refused to give up his passion. If anything, their taunts made him more determined to improve. He spent his lunch periods in the library, researching archery techniques and studying the biomechanics of proper form. He watched countless videos online of professional archers and Olympic competitors, taking notes and trying to incorporate their techniques into his own practice sessions. His mother noticed his dedication and, despite their financial struggles, managed to save enough money to buy him a few proper arrows for his birthday. Marcus was so moved by the gesture that he had tears in his eyes as he unwrapped them. Sarah had worked extra shifts for 2 weeks to afford those arrows, and Marcus knew it. That night, he promised himself that he would make her proud and show everyone that their family's circumstances didn't define their worth. The other person who believed in Marcus was Mrs. Rodriguez, his English teacher. She had noticed his quiet determination and the way he carried himself with dignity despite the constant harassment. Mrs. Rodriguez had been a competitive shooter herself in college and recognized the mental toughness that archery required. She would often encourage Marcus to pursue his passion and reminded him that true strength came from within, not from the approval of others. "You know, Marcus," she had told him one afternoon after class, "the greatest archers in history weren't always the most popular or the wealthiest. They were the ones who had the discipline to practice when no one was watching and the courage to keep going when everyone else told them they couldn't succeed." As winter approached, Marcus's skills had improved dramatically. His accuracy had become almost supernatural, and he could consistently hit targets at distances that would challenge experienced hunters. He had developed his own training routine, starting with close-range precision shots and gradually increasing the distance. His form had become fluid and natural, and he could draw, aim, and release an arrow in one smooth motion that seemed almost effortless. But nobody at school knew about his true abilities. To them, he was still just the weird kid with the old beau who lived in the cheap apartments. They saw his second-hand clothes and assumed he was just playing with toys, not understanding that he had developed into a genuinely skilled archer through years of dedicated practice and natural talent. The turning point came on a cold November morning when Marcus overheard Brad and his friends planning something that made his blood run cold. They were discussing the upcoming regional archery competition that was being held at the state fairgrounds just outside of town. The competition was open to anyone under 18. And the winner would receive a full scholarship to the state university's athletic program. "Can you imagine if that loser actually showed up?" Brad was saying to his friends near the lockers. "I heard my dad talking about sponsoring the event. Maybe I should enter just to embarrass him in front of everyone. How hard could it be to shoot a stupid arrow?" His friends laughed, but one of them, Jake, seemed less convinced. "I don't know, man. I heard he's actually pretty good. My little brother lives in his building and says he practices every day." "Pretty good?" Brad scoffed. "He's shooting at cardboard boxes with a bow that looks like it came from a garage sale. I could probably beat him with my eyes closed. Besides, even if he is decent, he'll choke when he sees a real crowd. Guys like him always do." Marcus felt his hands clench into fists, but he forced himself to walk away. He had learned long ago that confronting Brad directly would only make things worse. But as he sat in his next class, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had heard. A full scholarship to the state university would change everything for him and his mother. It would be his chance to prove that he was more than just the poor kid everyone loved to mock. That evening, Marcus approached his mother about the competition. Sarah was washing dishes after another long shift at the diner, her hands red and worn from the hot water and harsh detergent. When Marcus explained about the archery competition and the scholarship opportunity, her eyes lit up with a mixture of hope and concern. "The entry fee is $50, Marcus said quietly, knowing that $50 represented groceries for a week in their household. "I know it's a lot, but Mom, this could change everything for us." Sarah dried her hands and turned to face her son. She could see the determination in his eyes, the same look he had inherited from his grandfather. Without saying a word, she walked to the kitchen counter where she kept a small coffee tin filled with tip money she had been saving for Christmas presents. "Take what you need," she said simply. "I believe in you, Marcus. I always have." The next morning, Marcus registered for the competition. The event was scheduled for the following Saturday, giving him 1 week to prepare. He knew this would be his only chance to prove himself, and he threw himself into training with an intensity that surprised even him. Every morning before school, he would practice for an hour in the cold dawn light. After school, he would return to his makeshift range and continue until it was too dark to see. His neighbors began to take notice of his dedication, and some even stopped to watch him practice. Mrs. Breeze, Pattern Chen from the apartment below, started bringing him hot tea during his evening sessions, impressed by his focus and determination. At school, word had spread about Marcus entering the competition. Brad and his friends found this development hilarious and made sure everyone knew about it. They started a betting pool, with odds heavily favoring Marcus to embarrass himself spectacularly. The harassment intensified, with Brad making increasingly cruel comments about Marcus's chances. "I heard the registration fee was $50, Brad announced loudly during lunch one day. "That's probably their grocery money for the month. I hope his mom doesn't go hungry because her son wanted to play pretend archer." Marcus felt his face flush with anger, but Mrs. Rodriguez happened to be walking by and heard the comment. She stopped at Brad's table with a stern expression that made the teenagers shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Mr. Mitchell," she said in a voice that carried across the cafeteria, "it takes real courage to pursue your dreams when others try to tear you down. I wonder if you have that kind of courage." Brad's confident smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Whatever. We'll see on Saturday who's got courage and who's just delusional." As the week progressed, Marcus's training reached an almost meditative state. He had memorized every aspect of his form, and his arrows found their targets with mechanical precision. He practiced different scenarios, shooting from various angles and distances, preparing for whatever challenges the competition might present. His mother watched him practice each evening from their apartment window, and she could see the transformation in her son. The shy, uncertain boy was developing the quiet confidence of someone who knew their capabilities. His shoulders were straighter, his movements more deliberate, and there was a calm determination in his eyes that reminded her strongly of his grandfather. Friday evening, the night before the competition, Marcus carefully cleaned and inspected his bow. The old weapon showed its age, but it was perfectly maintained and tuned. His arrows were straight and true, each one hand-selected and balanced. He had only 12 arrows, far fewer than most competitors would bring, but he knew each one intimately. That night, Sarah made Marcus his favorite dinner with what little money remained after the entry fee. They sat together at their small kitchen table, and she shared stories about his grandfather's military service and his reputation as an exceptional marksman. "Your grandfather once told me," Sarah said, "that the most dangerous opponents are the ones everyone underestimates. They have nothing to lose and everything to prove." Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, with a bitter wind that would challenge even experienced archers. Marcus woke before dawn, too nervous to sleep longer. He dressed carefully in his cleanest clothes and gathered his equipment. The bow case was an old guitar case his mother had found at a thrift store, and it made him stand out even more among the other competitors who arrived with professional archery cases and sponsored team uniforms. The state fairgrounds were buzzing with activity when Marcus and his mother arrived. There were over 60 competitors registered for the youth division, ranging in age from 12 to 18. Many came with coaches, team members, and families carrying expensive equipment and wearing matching jackets with archery club logos. Marcus felt increasingly out of place as he looked around at the other competitors. They had professional compound bows with sights, stabilizers, and release aids that cost more than his family's monthly rent. Their arrows were carbon fiber masterpieces stored in climate-controlled cases. Some teenagers had entire support teams checking their equipment and discussing strategy. Brad arrived shortly after with a brand-new bow that still had price tags attached and a set of arrows that gleamed in the morning light. His father had apparently decided to make good on his threat to sponsor the event and had spared no expense in outfitting his son for competition. Brad's confidence was overwhelming as he strutted around the registration area, making sure everyone could see his expensive equipment. "Look what Daddy bought me," Brad announced loudly enough for Marcus to hear. "Top of the line everything. I almost feel bad about taking that scholarship away from people who actually need it." The competition format was announced. 3 rounds of increasing difficulty, with the lowest scores eliminated after each round. The first round would be at 30 yards, the second at 50 yards, and the final round at 70 yards. Each competitor would shoot 6 arrows per round, and only the top 12 would advance to the final round. As the competitors prepared for the first round, Marcus found a quiet corner to warm up. He drew his bow slowly, feeling the familiar tension and release. The whispers and pointing from other competitors barely registered as he focused on his breathing and form. This was his element, the place where all the practice and dedication would either pay off or prove insufficient. The first round began with competitors shooting in groups of 6. Marcus was placed in the third group, which meant he would have to watch 2 groups before his turn. As he observed the early competitors, he was struck by how many of them seemed nervous despite their expensive equipment. Several arrows missed the target entirely, and the scores were lower than he had expected. When Brad's group took their turn, Marcus watched carefully. Brad's form was technically correct but rushed, and his arrows clustered in the 7 and 8 rings rather than the perfect 10s he had been boasting about. His final score for the round was respectable, but not exceptional. Finally, it was Marcus's turn. As he stepped up to the shooting line with his worn bow and humble appearance, a murmur went through the crowd. Someone near the stands actually laughed, and Marcus could hear whispered comments about his equipment and clothes. Marcus took his position at the shooting line, blocking out the whispers and stares from the crowd. He could feel dozens of eyes on him, some curious, others dismissive, and a few openly mocking. Brad's voice carried clearly from the stands where he was holding court with his friends. "This should be entertaining," Brad said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I bet his arrows don't even reach the target from here." Marcus knocked his first arrow and drew the bowstring back to his anchor point. The familiar weight and balance of his grandfather's bow felt comforting in his hands. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering all those summer afternoons learning from the old man who had believed in him unconditionally. When he opened his eyes and looked downrange at the target, everything else faded away. The crowd, the pressure, the mocking voices, none of it mattered anymore. There was only him, the bow, and the target 30 yards away. His first arrow flew straight and true, embedding itself in the 10 ring with a satisfying thunk. The crowd fell silent for a moment, surprised by the accuracy from someone they had dismissed as a joke. But Marcus was already knocking his second arrow, his movements fluid and automatic from years of practice. The second arrow joined the first in the 10 ring, followed by the third, fourth, and fifth. Each shot was perfect, the arrows grouping so tightly that they were nearly touching each other. The crowd's murmurs had turned from dismissive to amazed, and even the other competitors were stopping their own preparations to watch. Marcus's 6th and final arrow for the round split the difference between 2 of his previous shots, creating a group that would have been impressive for an Olympic archer. The judges checked the target twice before announcing his score, a perfect 60 points, 6 10s in 6 shots. The crowd erupted in surprised applause, but Marcus barely heard it. He was already focused on the next round, knowing that the real challenge was yet to come. As he walked back to his equipment area, he could see Brad's confident expression had been replaced by something closer to concern. "Lucky shots," Brad muttered to his friends, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Beginner's luck always runs out. The first round eliminations were announced, and Marcus had finished not just in the qualifying group, but in first place overall. Several competitors with expensive equipment and impressive credentials had been eliminated, while the quiet boy with the old bow had shot a perfect round. During the break before the second round, Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at Marcus's side. She had driven out to watch the competition, bringing a thermos of hot chocolate that she pressed into his hands. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she whispered to him. "But remember, this is just the beginning. Stay focused on your process, not the results." The second round began with targets moved back to 50 yards. The wind had picked up, making the longer shot significantly more challenging. Several competitors who had advanced from the first round struggled with the increased distance and changing conditions. Arrows began missing the target entirely, and scores dropped dramatically. Marcus watched the early groups carefully, noting how the wind affected arrow flight and timing his shots accordingly. When Brad's group shot, the quarterback's nervousness was becoming apparent. His arrows scattered across the target, and his total score barely kept him in contention for the final round. When Marcus stepped up for his second round, the crowd had grown considerably. Word had spread about the unknown archer with the perfect first round, and spectators were gathering to see if he could repeat his performance at the longer distance. The wind gusted just as Marcus drew his first arrow, but he waited patiently for it to settle before releasing. The arrow fought through the air currents and found the 9 ring. A solid shot, but not perfect. The crowd murmured its approval, but Marcus was already analyzing the wind patterns for his next shot. His second arrow found the 10 ring, followed by his third and fourth. The fifth arrow drifted slightly in a crosswind and hit the 9 ring again, while his sixth and final shot was another perfect 10. His score of 58 points was more than enough to advance to the final round and kept him in first place overall. As the second round concluded, only 12 archers remained. Marcus was in the lead, followed by several competitors from established archery programs. Brad had barely qualified in 11th place, his expensive equipment unable to compensate for his lack of experience and growing nervousness. The final round would be at 70 yards, a distance that separated true archers from casual shooters. At this range, even small errors in form or judgment would send arrows wide of the target. The wind continued to swirl unpredictably, adding another layer of complexity to an already challenging shot. During the final break, Marcus found a quiet spot away from the crowds to center himself. His mother appeared beside him, her face glowing with pride and nervous excitement. "No matter what happens in this last round," she said softly, "I want you to know that you've already exceeded every dream I had for you today. Your grandfather is watching, and he's proud of the man you're becoming." Marcus hugged his mother tightly, drawing strength from her unwavering support. Around them, other competitors were making final adjustments to their equipment, consulting with coaches, and trying to manage their nerves. Marcus simply sat quietly with his bow across his lap, visualizing each shot of the final round. When the final round was called, the 12 remaining competitors gathered at the shooting line. The crowd had grown to several hundred spectators, including many who had heard about the unknown archer, and came to see if he could maintain his lead against more experienced competitors. Marcus was scheduled to shoot in the final group, meaning he would know exactly what score he needed to win before he took his first shot. As he watched the earlier groups, the pressure of the longer distance and swirling wind became evident. Even experienced archers were struggling, with several shooting scores in the 30s and 40s rather than the 50s needed to contend for the championship. Brad shot in the second group, and his nervousness had reached a breaking point. His first arrow missed the target entirely, sailing over the top into the safety netting behind. His second shot hit the outer rings for minimal points, and by his third arrow, it was clear he would not be a factor in the final standings. His expensive equipment lay scattered around his shooting position as he struggled to manage his nerves and technique. When the scores were tallied before the final group, Marcus knew he needed only 48 points out of a possible 60 to secure the championship. It was a reasonable score that should have reduced the pressure, but Marcus could feel the weight of expectation from the crowd and the magnitude of what winning would mean for his future. As he took his position for the final group, The fairgrounds fell unusually quiet. Even the wind seemed to still for a moment as Marcus nocked his first arrow. This was the moment that would define not just the competition, but potentially the entire trajectory of his life. Marcus stood at the 70-yard line, his grandfather's old bow steady in his hands despite the enormity of the moment. The crowd had grown silent. Hundreds of eyes focused on the teenager who had emerged from nowhere to dominate a competition that many had expected him to fail spectacularly. He could see his mother in the stands, her hands clasped tightly together, her face a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation. Mrs. Rodriguez sat beside her, offering quiet support. Even some of his classmates who had come to witness what they thought would be his public humiliation were now watching with grudging respect. Brad stood near the equipment area, his expensive bow abandoned as he watched the boy he had tormented for years prepare to claim a prize that Brad had assumed would be his by birthright. The quarterback's face showed a complex mixture of emotions: disbelief, anger, and perhaps for the first time, genuine respect for someone he had never bothered to truly see. Marcus drew his bowstring back to his anchor point, feeling the familiar tension that had become as natural as breathing. At 70 yards, the target looked impossibly small, a distant circle that seemed to waver in the shifting light. The wind had picked up again, adding invisible currents that could push an arrow off course in the fraction of a second it took to reach the target. He held at full draw for several seconds, reading the wind patterns and waiting for the right moment. When he released his first arrow, it arced high into the air before dropping toward the target with deadly precision. The arrow struck the 9 ring, a solid shot that drew appreciative murmurs from the knowledgeable spectators. His second arrow found the 10 ring dead center, followed by his third, which landed just inside the 10 ring as well. The crowd was fully invested now, understanding they were witnessing something special. Camera phones appeared as people began recording the final shots of what was clearly an exceptional performance. Arrow 4 hit the 9 ring again, still a good score, but Marcus knew he needed to maintain his focus. The math was simple. He needed just 6 more points from his final 2 arrows to secure the championship and the scholarship that would change his life forever. As he knocked his 5th arrow, a gust of wind swirled across the range, strong enough to move the target flags and cause several spectators to pull their jackets tighter. Marcus held at full draw, waiting patiently for the wind to settle. The seconds stretched out as he remained motionless, his form perfect and unwavering despite the physical strain of holding the bow at full draw. When the wind calmed, Marcus released smoothly. The arrow flew true, finding the 10 ring once again. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, understanding that he had all but secured the victory. But Marcus was already nocking his final arrow, determined to finish with the same precision and focus he had maintained throughout the competition. This last shot was for more than just the competition. It was for every time Brad and his friends had mocked him in the hallways. It was for his mother, who had sacrificed so much to give him this opportunity. It was for his grandfather's memory and the values the old man had instilled in him. Most importantly, it was for himself and the dream that had sustained him through years of ridicule and self-doubt. Marcus drew the bowstring one final time, his form as perfect as it had ever been. The target seemed to grow larger in his vision, and he could almost feel his grandfather's presence beside him, guiding his aim as he had all those summers ago. When he released the string, the arrow flew with a pure trajectory that seemed to cut through the air itself. The arrow struck the target with a resounding thump that echoed across the suddenly silent fairgrounds. For a moment, nobody moved as the judges walked downrange to score the final shots. Then the head judge raised his arm with all 10 fingers extended, signaling a perfect 10 to close out the competition. The crowd exploded in cheers and applause that seemed to shake the ground. Marcus had not only won the championship, but had done so with a total score that would have been competitive at adult national competitions. His final round score of 56 points, combined with his earlier rounds, gave him a commanding victory margin. As Marcus walked downrange to retrieve his arrows, he was surrounded by competitors, coaches, and spectators who wanted to congratulate him and learn more about his background. Several college coaches who had attended the competition were already approaching his mother to discuss recruitment opportunities beyond just the scholarship he had already earned. But the moment that mattered most came when Brad Mitchell approached him near the target. The quarterback who had made Marcus's life miserable for years stood quietly for a moment, his usual arrogance replaced by something that looked like genuine humility. "I owe you an apology," Brad said quietly, his voice barely audible over the continuing celebration around them. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about a lot of things." Marcus looked at his former tormentor and felt something unexpected, not triumph or vindication, but a kind of peaceful understanding. The boy who had once seemed so powerful and untouchable now appeared small and uncertain, struggling to come to terms with having his worldview challenged so completely. "Thank you," Marcus replied simply. "That means something." As the awards ceremony began, Marcus found himself standing on the top step of a makeshift podium, holding a trophy that represented far more than a simple archery competition. The scholarship would allow him to attend college and pursue his dreams without the financial burden that had seemed insurmountable just that morning. But more than the material prize, Marcus had gained something invaluable, the knowledge that dedication, perseverance, and quiet dignity could overcome any amount of mockery or doubt. He had proven to himself and everyone else that true strength came not from wealth or popularity, but from the courage to pursue excellence regardless of what others thought. In the months that followed, Marcus's story spread throughout the archery community and beyond. He was invited to train with Olympic development programs and received scholarship offers from universities across the country. The old bow that had seemed so inadequate compared to modern equipment was retired to a place of honor in their apartment, a reminder of how far determination could carry someone. Brad Mitchell, meanwhile, began to change as well. The humbling experience of being so thoroughly outclassed by someone he had dismissed led him to examine his own behavior and assumptions. He never became close friends with Marcus, but he stopped his bullying entirely and even defended other students when he saw them being picked on. Mrs. Rodriguez was not surprised by any of these developments. She had seen the quiet strength in Marcus from the beginning and had known that someday the world would recognize what she had always seen. On the Monday after the competition, she pulled Marcus aside after class. "You know," she said with a smile, "I always told you that the greatest archers weren't always the most popular or the wealthiest. Sometimes they're just the ones brave enough to keep shooting when everyone else tells them they'll miss." Marcus smiled back, his grandfather's bow case slung over his shoulder as he prepared for another afternoon of practice. Because even though he had proven himself beyond any doubt, he knew that excellence was not a destination, but a journey that required constant dedication and humility. The boy who had been mocked and dismissed had become a champion, not through luck or accident, but through the simple power of refusing to give up on himself. And in a world that often seemed to value appearance over substance, Marcus Thompson had shown that true strength was quiet, patient, and absolutely deadly accurate when it mattered most.